Hi, welcome to a special edition of Mr. Nowak's Classroom, the Virtually Irrelevant podcast. We have gender expert, author, Sam Killerman here. A first for the podcast. We have someone who's been on TED Talks, which is kind of a bucket list thing for me.
Yeah, cool.
Here to join us.
Okay.
Thank you, Sam. From Texas to Renfrew.
Yeah.
Tell us about your journey, your road.
Well, literally, I flew from Austin to Houston to the way that I ended up here, I think, was actually through my book. Mr. Wright, Mike Wright, was using my book in his social justice class and reached out, and they were curious to see if I'd be willing or interested in coming and spending a week in Ontario and speaking at a bunch of schools, and I was thrilled.
So speaking of your book, A Guide to Gender, you can look at it, guidetogender.com. You can buy it on Amazon. As Sam just mentioned, it serves as a quote-unquote textbook for the social justice class here at RCI. What inspired you to get into this field of gender and social justice?
Growing up, I had a lot of odd experiences with people misunderstanding, or I use this word very intentionally, misdiagnosing my gender or my sexuality. I have a lot of funny stories or awkward stories of times that people have assumed me to be gay and I'm not gay, or have asked me questions about my gender that would suggest it's something other than man. And those experiences initially, they terrified me and they freaked me out, and they made me really uncomfortable. But when I started to dig into where they were coming from, I started learning about gender and I became fascinated. And that was about a decade ago, and I've just been learning and talking about it ever since.
So a real, taking a passion and turning it into a career.
Yeah,
And that's kind of like the dream.
Okay, yeah, for sure, yeah.
So we often talk in a careers type class, follow your passion and turn it into a career, and that's what you've done. So I think that's very inspiring for a lot of people.
Cool. Yeah.
What's Texas like in terms of equity? It probably has a certain stereotype.
Yeah.
So what's...
Unfortunately, I'd say the stereotype, if you've got a good understanding of what you think Texas is like, is probably fairly accurate as far as the institutional equity goes. As a state, our state government is not a very just government for somebody who is anything but the straight, white, cisgender, non-disabled, middle-class man. We don't have a lot of good educational interventions, social program interventions, and other things to help lift up the people who have been pushed down. And I mean, we just got word, and I haven't looked into this yet, this was a few hours ago, that Texas is going to be moving to completely abstinence-only sex education, which is opposite the direction that most of the other states are going in as far as sex ed. And from what I hear here in Ontario, y'all are starting to consider
it's a hot button issue here, which has inspired a lot of debate. Mm-hmm. But from my perspective, we just don't know what it is yet.
Yeah.
From my perspective as a left-leaning teacher, learning about the body parts at an early age and about consent can be very healthy to deconstruct a lot of things and hopefully put a stop to our high numbers of sexual abuse. Let kids know what abuse is and such. So when the curriculum actually comes out, I hope we are not too quick to judge and actually read what's going on.
So the curriculum's not even out yet?
Well, it's out, but it's not implemented yet. But I don't know how many people have actually read it. I think we're just scared.
Okay.
We're scared of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
In your TED Talks, you talk about how we have 7 billion people, but in gender we try to just divide it by 2. You're either a male or a female. You want to talk about that, the difficulty of pigeonholing people into those? Yeah.
So specifically, I would say we tend to call people men or women, and the reason why I clarify that language versus male or female is because we tend to think of, or I tend to think of specifically male as describing the physical body, and man is describing the social role or the social identity, the social expectations. So a lot of people who are born male also identify as a man, and they grow up and they fulfill the social expectations or the social norms of a man. But yeah, so in that way, man and woman as labels of like social roles are really just like super oversimplified ways of classifying personality. They're ways of saying that you should act these ways, be these ways, do these things, and interact with these types of people. And yeah, we only give 7 billion people in the world 2 ways to be a person. And we know that there are way more ways to be a person, right? But we constantly see people primarily through this gendered lens. We see people, first and foremost, oftentimes through our gender, like the way that we're supposed to see the world because of our gender, and then the perceived gender of other people. And then we treat people based on that perception.
I had the opportunity to take a gender studies class in university.
Okay.
And that's a while ago, but we read a story. It's called a Child Named X. And they were trying to raise the child without complete, without any,
gender neutral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we just realized how gendered our society is.
Yeah.
And I was at a social justice conference last week, and they had a gender neutral washroom.
Okay.
And I just wondered, how far away are we from that? Or is that a trend? Would that be important to a social justice movement, do you think?
Yeah, hugely important. It's funny that you bring that up. I had been kind of like popping into town halls around the States for the past few years as those conversations about gender-neutral restrooms started coming up. And I'd pop into these town halls, and for a couple of years I just listened. I listened to people's concerns, what they're afraid of. And then last year I wrote kind of a snarky blog post, and one of the big things that kept coming up was like, what do you put on the door? Like, what do we put on the door? How do we signify this? Like, we have the little person in the dress, we have the little person with the pants, and we know what those mean, but what would we put on this door? And that was like the issue that people kept using to avoid talking about the real issue, which is that people are just afraid of this idea. So I wrote a snarky blog post. I'm like, here's what we put on the door: a toilet. And I drew a picture of a toilet. I was like, that's what's on the inside. That's what goes on the door. And I published it, and it got like picked up by a bunch of different places. It ended up on like cool websites I read, like Fast Company or Wired, and it was like it grew and grew and grew, and now it's becoming the sign. Like, it's being used on over, I think at least 4, I think there's 5 continents now that have this sign being used. It's just a picture of a toilet, and the sign, the door says all gender. It's used in the White House now in the States,
wow,
which is so cool.
Wow.
I just found that out last week. And I just made it. I made it available for free, and a bunch of people are using it now. And it's one of those things that, like, you know, like you said with the sex ed curriculum, people are afraid of it because they haven't really thought about what it actually means. And what it actually means is that there are just going to be people peeing in a room. Like, that's all. Like, that's what's been happening. Nothing's going to happen that's like going to be scary. There's no evidence historically that a person, like a trans person, is going to commit any act of anything against a cisgender person. There is a lot of evidence historically that shows that trans people are very vulnerable and very much at risk, and often experience violence in bathrooms at the hands of cisgender people. So having an all-gender restroom or a gender-neutral restroom is creating a safe space for those people, as well as for anybody else who just wants to, like, oftentimes there'll be like a single stall, you know, like a room where you just, like at a small restaurant, you go and you lock the door. Why are we gendering those restrooms anyway?
Yeah.
Like, if you're just in there by yourself,
yeah,
why do we even have to gender them?
We talk about transgender and how at risk they are for mental health issues, for being victims of abuse, and for suicide. How can a movement and getting the word out there and acceptance help these people? I don't want to say these people, but help transgender people feel accepted and feel safe?
In a lot of ways. I mean, they're from like the big picture institutional level. Trans identities or gender identities would need to be protected the same way that other identities are for things like employment, hate crimes, just any other protections. And in Ontario they are. So Ontario is actually pretty forward when it comes to protecting gender identity, the same way that it would protect like a religious identity or an ethnic or racial identity, which is huge. So that's a big important thing. On the smaller picture, like more interpersonal level, the movement is trying to help people realize that it's not a disease, it's not a problem, it's just the way some people are. and that if you stigmatize a person because they're trans, or if you have like this historic idea that it's like some sort of a disorder, as opposed to just a different way that some other people experience gender, then you're going to treat them in harmful ways. You're going to make them feel like they're not able to be. They're not able to be themselves, able to be around, able to be alive, whatever. But if you just recognize that this is just a person who experiences gender in a way that's probably different from you, just like every other person experiences gender in a way that's different from you, then you can just see them as a person and make them feel able to be, or safe to be, them around you.
I'm going to jump. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to jump to masculinity.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about classes about this. There's a Chevy commercial.
Okay.
And has a commercial, or has a two pictures, and it's the same man beside a truck, same man beside like a eco-friendly vehicle.
Okay.
And they have this focus group, and they're saying, well, who's the man here? Who's more masculine?
Okay.
And I'm like, it's 2015,
yeah,
and we're still doing this. It drives me nuts.
Oh, when I was at the rental car place in Ottawa, getting my rental car, I come out, and this is the second time this has happened, so I was like ready for this. I come out, everybody always assumes I'm gay. It happens in weird ways. I come out, and they're like, you can have whichever car you want. There's 3 cars. One's this tiny, adorable little car that I immediately wanted because it was super cute. And then the other 2 were like big, clunky, like SUV and like a big, clunky sedan. And I was getting ready to say, I want the Golf. And then the person goes, oh, but I bet I know which one you want. And I was like, oh, man, really? Like, this is popping into my head. And I go, why? And he goes, well, don't gay people like small cars? And
no.
I was like, you've got to be kidding. Or don't gay men like small cars? And I was like, oh, I'm in such a tough place here because I don't want to like affirm his problematic toxic masculinity stereotyping. But I also love tiny cars, and I want that little car, so I picked it. And I was like, I'm taking the Golf, and it's not because of what you think. And I like went and got it. See, but you're right. Everything is gendered, and like masculinity is held to this like impossible to win contest, because as soon as you feel like you're masculine enough, you constantly have to prove it. And that's what that commercial is saying. It's saying like that man is like probably like a rancher or some other masculine job.
Yeah.
He's probably killing animals constantly.
Cutting down trees.
Yeah. Probably never used lotion in his life. And then it's like all of that isn't enough. Now you have to pick the right car. It's an impossible to win game that just keeps moving the goalposts in a really harmful, really terrifying way.
So this kind of builds on, in our class, we talk about Jackson Katz.
Okay,
who's
for sure. Yeah.
Anti-violence masculinity expert.
Yeah.
And he talks about how males have to put on a tough guise, like a disguise. It's a play on words.
Yeah.
And how, males are stereotypically supposed to be tough and not show emotion. And has that caused an anti-learning culture for males? Because, and in Ontario, I saw a recent statistic that 84% of elementary school teachers in Ontario are actually female, which that boggles my mind. Of, do we have young males in schools? How are they learning? How are they coping? Do you see a quote-unquote feminization of education or an anti-learning culture? Yeah,
I definitely do, and you see that in post-secondary education too. Like back in the 70s, and I'm bad at remembering statistics, so I'll just like generalize. It was something like 60% of university students in the States were men, and now it's closer to 40%. So in the 40 years, it's completely flipped in the ratio, and it's projected to keep going lower, which will mean there are fewer men with post-secondary degrees, with bachelor's degrees, university degrees, which will mean there are fewer men in professions like teaching that require those types of degrees. And yeah, it's creating a vacuum of positive male or positive role models who are men for young people, which I think is harmful to young people of all genders. I think it's just as harmful to young women to not have a positive man in their life, like that they see in a healthy way, other than their dad. Like if the only other portrayals of like man they have are like movies and stuff, they're not getting a pretty accurate portrayal of what it means to be a man. But I think it's also very harmful for young boys to not have like a teacher or somebody in their school, or as many people in their school they can look up to. And the feminization of the field thing, so there's 2 different like ways of thinking about that, and the one that I thought you were getting at was this idea that when a field becomes feminized, there's this research in sociology that shows that as a field becomes feminized, meaning it changes the balance of like from majority men to either equal men and women to majority women, we start to devalue that field. So we start to pay those people lower salaries. We start to fund those jobs less, and you see this in like STEM fields as much as you see it in educational fields.
Wow.
And that's like one of the biggest evidences, I suppose, if that's a word, bits of evidence that suggest like, or that show how much we devalue femininity and how much we like prioritize masculinity, even though what it means to be those different things changes constantly. As they change, like as teaching becomes a feminine thing, we start to undervalue it. Or as like another industry, as like medicine becomes a feminine thing, we'll start to devalue it, which is really just, it gets back to the thing I mentioned a few minutes ago, where it's like, it's an impossible contest. Like the masculinity thing, constantly having to prove masculinity, you're never going to win.
Yeah, I've never thought of it in that way, which is what education is like, right? Learning.
For sure, yeah, absolutely.
Now, would you say, we talk about a term, male corporate culture.
Yeah.
And if you look at the composition of the Forbes Fortune 500, or
there's like 3 or something,
it's
right?
ridiculous, right?
For women, yeah.
So do you still feel that exists?
Yeah, yeah.
And how do we go about to dispel that? You know, women can be committed to business, not necessarily the family. How do we kind of dispel that?
You know, well, this is my thing. Like this is my like soapbox. But,
I love it.
You know Sheryl Sandberg? Do you know who that is?
I don't.
One of like the chief officers at Facebook has written a book called Lean In, and it's a book about how women can succeed in business. And what the book and like what this general idea is suggesting is that the culture isn't bad, but that women need to learn how to participate in that culture. Basically, the culture isn't the problem. It's you as a woman who's the problem, and you need to be more masculine. You need to ask for the things you want. You need to demand higher salaries. You need to seek out leadership positions. And essentially, all of the things that we in our society categorize as like masculine behaviors, we need to continue valuing those, and women just need to be those things. But what's not changing is the fact that like what's led to the corporate culture being vast majority men is that we value or we overvalue, quote, masculine traits like authoritarianism or strong-willed or like being demanding, being whatever, as opposed to starting to value things like softer traits, so to speak, like being empathic or being a good listener or being people-centered or focused on like the people in the organization, even though we know that those other things tend to lead to better leaders. Like we know that good listeners are better leaders than non-good listeners. We know honest, empathic people are better leaders than like dishonest, psychopathic people, yet we have this culture that rewards psychopathy, not empathy, and that rewards dishonesty, not honesty.
That's just fascinating. So there's some statistics to kind of support the this male corporate culture.
Yeah.
Not only the Forbes list or the composition of CEOs. There was a Statistics Canada report that for every dollar males make in Canada, females are making about 81 cents. A lot of the students here will say, well, that's not bad. That's progress.
Yeah, it used to be like 70.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So how would you respond to that comment?
I mean, it's true. Like, I think that we do need to recognize progress when it happens.
Okay.
And that if things are better than they used to be, we should celebrate that. Because we don't do that very often in like social justice movements or in any sort of like, we don't recognize like things are better, and we should own that. That's true. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying to make them ever better. A lot of people debate those statistics, like the ones about the 80 cents on the dollar, 70 cents on the dollar, and you can find evidence to support both sides really, really easily, which is part of the problem of the internet, I guess, is it doesn't really matter what's true. If you have a hypothesis, you can find evidence to support it, right? But I think for me, structural diversity, meaning like having an equal amount of men and women in like the Forbes CEO list, wouldn't necessarily determine in my mind that we've made much progress or enough progress. For me, it would be a changing of the culture where in those super high societally valued positions, we start to recognize that things like asking for help being empathic, being like other people focused, caring about the members of your organization, things like that, things that typically aren't valued right now and things that are considered feminine. Until we value those things, the culture hasn't really changed. We've just changed the players in the culture.
Fascinating. Talk about, sometimes the language is very powerful.
Yeah.
But then language can be rooted in some discriminatory ideas.
Yeah.
I fall victim at sometimes saying to a class that's filled with males and females, okay, guys,
you guys,
listen.
yeah.
And I don't think I realized I say that as much until recently.
Okay.
Can you talk about like the role that language has in perpetrating stereotypes, or the role that language has in the social justice movement?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a y'aller. I say y'all.
Okay.
And I've been getting picked on a lot by your people, by your fellow Canadians for yawling, and I'm sticking to it. I like y'all. I think it's fun. But I think, have you ever heard the term microaggression before?
No, no.
Okay. So language is an example of a microaggression. When we think about like discrimination or oppression, or like sexism or racism, we tend to think about these huge things that happen, like really violent, make the news headlines things, right? We jump straight to genocide, these huge things. When we think about those big issues, we don't think as much about the little things that lead up to those. And a lot of people call those microaggressions.
Oh,
and the
I like
way
that
that
term.
you use language to either include or exclude people, whether it's intentional or not, can be a form of microaggression. So if you're in a space, especially if the space is a space that is typically a male space, like if you're in a business setting, it's like, how do you gentlemen feel about this? And there's like two women there, and you're saying, how do you gentlemen feel? It's reinforcing this idea that those people aren't welcome in that space. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense.
So in that way, trying to use language that doesn't exclude people within reason, and in the case of like saying you guys or saying you all or saying you folks or whatever, that just lets everyone know on this really micro way that their voice is welcome. Though I will say that guys has become so socialized to be like just the plural.
Yeah, and so I really struggle with it. Like, has that term been
I struggled with it for a while too.
In terms of transgender and gender reassignment, it's becoming a little more popular in the media, and I never thought I would talk about Kardashians or Bruce Jenner.
Oh yeah, that keeps coming up.
Of what he's going through.
Yeah.
Is the attention that Bruce Jenner's going through, do you think this can have a positive spin, or is it?
It's so tough. I don't know, right? Like, I don't know. But I will say that generally I think that awareness of or the fact that this is being covered in popular media, that it's somebody who people like, you know, feel an attachment to, they feel like they know or whatever, and seeing that person undergo this experience, or I'm not even entirely sure if Bruce Jenner is like going to like. Yeah,
I don't know. I just know I hear it.
Yeah, there's all the tabloid stuff.
Yeah.
I think that it's a really problematic way that a lot of it's been reported. And for a lot of trans people, it's like, that I've talked to, it's like, this is why I'm not going to come out, because I don't want to be put through this like circus, like media circus type thing. But I think that the net gain, even if it's a tiny, tiny bit, will be positive. I think the net gain of it is, I just tend to think that light is the best disinfectant, and shedding light on these things. The idea of questioning one's gender is something that most people experience in little ways or in big ways. But it's something that most people at some point in their life, they may not have been able to name that that's what was happening, but it's something that we struggle with often, with our expectations or others' expectations of ourselves that are almost always gendered. And the more that we have conversations where people are like, hopefully honestly discussing like what that means to them, and if they are transitioning or if they are coming out as trans in an authentic way, I think the more that we do that, the better it is for everybody.
I love what you said, light can be a disinfectant, or light can be the
Yeah.
best disinfectant. I think you should probably patent that, because that'd be a great shirt. That'd be a great shirt.
I think that's like an old like aphorism or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got all those like
Trademark that, I
colloquialisms.
think.
Oh gosh, I've released the copyright on everything I've made. I'm still like anti patent law, copyright law, and stuff. But I'll do that one.
Okay. Awesome. All right. So we've been joined by Sam Killerman. You got a little taste of what Sam's all about, and a taste of what his passion is, and an insight into gender. Can you maybe self-promote here? How else can people get involved or learn more about your book, or buy your book?
If you want to buy the book, it's at guidetogender.com. My main website that I write on, where I write about gender and sexuality, is itspronouncemetrosexual.com. It's a super long domain. SamKillerman.com, I blog at SamuelKillerman.com, has kind of like a list of other projects that I do, and then Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the Renfrew County District School Board and OSSTF for bringing you in. I hope you've enjoyed Renfrew County. I hope to enjoy Austin at some point.
Yeah, it's a great place.
Great spot.
Strongly recommend it.
Awesome. So thank you again. Follow him on Twitter at Killerman. And thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.